To start a new study or a new series in the book of Daniel from next Sunday. And really, it's been an interesting ride, and I'm going to comment on this a little bit because I think my original intention in what I saw God was wanting to speak to us has kind of shifted a little bit. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But let's go ahead and get into the word for today. And I'm not thinking, but regardless, go ahead. All right, so first question. This is something I just want you to think about, is understanding the season, the time that we're in right now. In the story of Joseph that we're in, they're in the middle of this worldwide famine that was going to go on for 7 years. They're now 2 years into this. And so the question I want to raise today is, where are we? When you think about Western culture, when you think about Korean culture, when you think about the spirituality of these places that we're from, I don't know about you, but for me personally, I feel like we've already kind of headed into a spiritual famine. Really, if you think about many of the things that are going on, especially in America, we're moving into an age where you're actually being persecuted for stating what you believe in. Right? We're getting back to an age where there's a relatively high cost for standing firm in your beliefs. I'll touch upon that a little bit later, but this is just something I want you to keep in the back of your head as we get into the passage today. So, again, all right, Genesis 45. I think this isn't working, so you're going to click for me. Okay, Genesis 45, go ahead and turn in your Bibles, open up your smartphones, or look at the screen above, where the Lord says this. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the reign of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourself, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly.' Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brother had come, Joseph and all his officials were pleased. Or Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." You are also directed to tell them, "Do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours." So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent. This is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way." So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt." Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they had told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And and God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father. He said, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport him. So Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan. Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons and his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring. Amen. So this is, again, the conclusion of our series on the study of Joseph and really, what he's teaching us. And I'll get into that in a second, but really, again, the theme that we started off this year was the new life. Last year we talked a lot about missions. We went to the book of Acts. We saw that God was a missional God. He raised up the church to be missional. But this year we wanted to look more in terms of how does God desire us to live our lives on a day-to-day basis? And when we look at the story of Joseph, what we see first and foremost is that there are multiple things going on from the generations. He's the fourth generation believer in his family, right? And you see that because of the generations before him, there are things that have put him into the situation he's in. There's generational sin that has caused favoritism and has caused him to be hated by his brothers, so much so that they sell him into slavery. But then the generational blessings have passed down, and Joseph, you see, is finding favor upon favor in every single hardship and struggle that he has. He's able to overcome it. But lastly, we see also that the fulfillments that God, as he raises him up out of these difficulties, the things that he is fulfilling are not just his dreams, his wants, but they're actually those of the generations before him, specifically his father Jacob. Next slide, please. If you see, last week we talked specifically about how last week in the previous two chapters, a new character came up, Judah. Now Judah was the very brother that had sold him into slavery. It was Judah's idea, hey, let's not kill him, let's sell him as a slave, we can get money that way. Right? Probably the brother he hated the most. But then we see a transformation in Judah. Judah takes over ownership of the family. He's the fourth eldest. His older brothers have failed every single test. And they are just, they were just disappointments to the family. Judah himself was a disappointment. But he raises himself up. God lifts him up. He takes ownership of the family. He rebukes his own father and says, what are you doing? We're going to die unless we do something. And then when they go back and they go to Joseph, he doesn't know who Joseph is. To him, Joseph is the ruler of all of Egypt, and this man is telling him to go back or to leave Benjamin, his youngest brother, as a slave. And he knew that would destroy his father. And he says, you know what? Let me take his place. He's the first person in the Bible to do that. The first person to say, I would choose to take the burden of someone else. I will sacrifice myself for him. And we see from that Judah is the one exalted. Joseph is one of the heroes of the story too, but Judah, as we all know, becomes the line of kings. Right? Not Joseph. And so we see this man rise, and we see him bring reconciliation. So next slide, we see that Joseph, he has to respond. Now, as I said before, I don't know what Joseph's motivation was for why he was doing the things that he was doing. Honestly, he really messed with the heads of his brothers. This was a very mean thing that he did. I'm sure he had whatever motivations that he might have had, but he couldn't handle it anymore. So he responds by crying. For the third time, right? Like the other two times, he ran away and cried by himself, but here he can't control it. And he says, "Everybody get out! Get out!" And he starts crying in front of everybody, right? Very emotional, everything's just coming out. And this is the response of the brother that was sold into slavery, that is seeing the brother that sold him into slavery actually asking to take the place of another brother. He's moved by that. And so we see this reconciliation. Next slide, please. And so now he speaks and he tells them, "I am Joseph." And these brothers are probably wondering, "Oh no, he's going to kill us." Like, this is why he's been messing with us, because he's ready to kill us from all that we've done. And he says, "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." This is some 22 years later, right, after this all happened. And Joseph himself sees that there was a reason for all of the suffering. So much so, next slide please, that he doesn't blame his brothers. Next slide please. Instead, he points everything back to God. He keeps saying, "God sent me here." He says it 3 times. "God sent me here. God sent me here. I was not sent by you, but by God." Right? He makes it very clear that even though they were technically the reason why he ended up there, it was all God's plan. Even how he raised to become the number 2 man in Egypt was all of God's plan. He never points back to himself. And so moving further into the story, Pharaoh confirms this, and when Pharaoh hears the news, he basically tries to one-up Joseph. He's like, "You know what? I'll give you the best. I'll give you everything. Don't even bring anything. Like, you can have everything here in Egypt, right? You can even have carts." Carts are, they're practical. but you see that the favor of God is rich, and it is just being lavished upon his family. Next slide, please. And so when news gets back to Jacob, first off, he had to be shocked. For 22 years, he had thought his son was dead. And now that he hears that this son is the ruler of Egypt, and he brings back all this nice stuff, Jacob is just overwhelmed. And it talks about how he returns to himself. And you see the passage there, it changes from calling him Jacob to Israel. It's like he finally, in Korean, what? 정신 차렸어, right? Like he finally got his stuff together, right? And he's like, wow. And next slide, please. You see that God himself doesn't leave him in the dark. As he's making the preparations to go back, the Almighty, who I talked about last week, the Almighty, the God that had revealed himself to every single generation and had revealed himself to him twice, now reveals himself to him again to say, you can go to Egypt. Do not worry, you will be safe. God loves to bring confirmation. I know a lot of people, let me just go off topic a little bit. A lot of people, I've always shared this, the number one thing people always ask me when it comes to just general questions that you ask a pastor is like, what do I do with my life? I don't know what to do. I guess it's because I'm with young people. Older people don't really ask this question. But I was like, I don't like. I'm about to graduate. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so, what I want to tell you is what this passage kind of shows is that when we are moving along the path of God, He brings us confirmation. Whether it's Him, speaking to us directly, He gives us confirmation when we are following the right path. And so I think for many of us, when we have that indecisive point of not knowing what to do, God will make it clear, and He will give you confirmation as you progress. Next slide, please. So now we find out later that Jacob, Jacob was getting close to the end of his life. We find out that he's going to live for 17 more years. So he ends up living the last 17 years of his life with Joseph and all the family. And what we see here is that this was a very urgent thing for them to do. They're now 2 years in famine. There are 5 more years left. This was going to be a very difficult season. If you look in the rest of the next couple of chapters in Genesis, you see that Egypt had it really bad. Even though for 7 years they had stored up all this food, the people were, like, they didn't have any means of producing any of their own food. So they end up selling all of their belongings, their land, everything to Egypt. Right? It ends up being a very difficult struggle. Now, Joseph is very fair about it, but you see that it was a very difficult season. And you have to imagine that outside of Egypt, there were probably many people perishing. Think about it. 7 years, you cannot produce any single food. That's a long time. And so it was a very important thing for this family to be saved, to be brought into Egypt to save them. And this family, at this point, including Joseph's, number 70. Right? 70 people are saved through this one action. Now granted, of course, by the fact that Joseph is in control, all of Egypt is literally saved. Right? So it's not just this family that's being saved. It's a very large group of people that's being saved. But it was important for them to leave Canaan, because if they didn't, they would have died. Very simple. Next slide, please. And so, further on, you go, Jacob finally passes away 17 years later. He gives this long passage where he speaks both curses and blessings to his family. Every single son. Some of them he says some really bad stuff. Some of them he's like, it's really nice. But man, some of them it's like, wow, this is an angry father. That's his last word to his son. Wow. I wouldn't want that to be that's with my father. But anyway, he has this moment where he speaks to all of his family. He proclaims curses and blessings. Then he passes away. And then his brothers are like, uh-oh. Joseph's now he's gonna get his revenge. Now that dad's gone, Joseph's finally gonna crack the whip on us. And so they come up with this story, and they go to Joseph and they're like, hey, before dad died, he said to be nice to us. Like literally, that's like what they say. And this is Joseph's response. He says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Remarkable that this is a man that had every right to hold a grudge. Every right to treat his brothers harshly, to get revenge for all that they had done to him. And yet, he sees that this was all God's plan. And he doesn't want to take any credit, and he doesn't want to exert his own, selfish desires upon them. Next slide, please. So the main things is, I want us first to really understand what are the things that we can learn from Joseph. What are the things that we as individuals can take back as challenges in how we're supposed to live our lives? And these are the things, and I've covered these in these previous passages, in these previous sermons, that these were the things that highlighted who Joseph was. No matter how successful he was, he always credited it to God's glory. Now at the same time, Joseph, I'm sure, was a man of many talents. Obviously, for someone to run an entire kingdom like Egypt, this guy had to have skills. But never did he take credit for it. He always says, the glory is to God. And you also see that this is a man that actually, he ends up being in the good favor of people of high status. First with Potiphar, right? And then with the cupbearer, and then with Pharaoh himself. This is a man with very powerful friends. But you can see in every single passage, they don't matter. It's only his relationship with God that matters. He's not leveraging the powerful allies that he has. He's only leveraging his relationship with God. We saw with Potiphar's wife that in the midst of temptation, now let me remind you, temptation itself is not sin. It is how we respond to temptation. When we act, that is sin. So he's tempted by Potiphar's wife, and what's he do? He runs away. He leaves his cloak behind, knowing that that will likely cause him so much grief and pain. He runs away. He stands firm. And lastly, what we're seeing through this current passage is that when he looks back at the 22 years, 13 years as a slave, and now these 9 years of ruling Egypt, this was all part of the plan of God. So that suffering that he went through, all these difficulties that he had a purpose. And he's able to point that back and realize none of this is wasted. This was all God's plan. And so for us, these are the challenges I want us to take when we're thinking about how do we live our lives in the given circumstances that we have. Next slide, please. So the question is, will we go like Job? Will we live our lives in a way that we are constantly pointing back to God, giving glory to God? When we looked at the passages before, whenever Joseph was successful, the people that were above him actually looked at him and said, wow, God has favor on this man. They don't even believe in God. And they're like, if there's a God, he's doing some awesome things for this guy. Right? Joseph himself was a testimony to who God was through his success. And that is one of our challenges. God desires us, in many ways, to be successful in the things that we do for the sake of giving glory back to him, not to us. So we see with Joseph that he has allegiance to God. We see that he stands firm. We see that he sees that there is reason for suffering and trials in his life, and he gives glory back to God for all these things. These are the challenges that we have as we ask ourselves the question, will we go like Job in our given circumstances, in our given difficulties? That's the main point I wanted to get across today, but there's kind of a tangent I wanted to get to as well. Next slide, please. So I titled this passage, or the sermon, Preserving a Remnant. And then, there's a brief note on this in verse 7 of 45. Next slide, please. And we see that this is actually the first time that the noun form of this word is used in the entire Bible. But this is a word that's very common throughout the Old Testament. It shows up 26 times. And it's a very common description of the people that survive or remain. Right? They use this to talk specifically about the remnant of Israel, the remnant of Jacob. So much so that becomes one of the main identifications of true Israelites. And if you were to fast forward to the New Testament, probably true Christians. Right? There's this concept that there is always going to be a remnant, a portion that will survive different periods of struggles and difficulties. They will be the only ones left. Now, as I looked upon this, and in this passage, we're seeing 70 people being saved. Right? Next slide, please. But one of the things, as you look throughout the Bible, whenever there's an action of like kind of global scale salvation, it's always done on a remnant. It's not done on a whole civilization. Right? You think back to Noah, right? How many people survived the quote-unquote flood? Was it 13? I thought it was 8. I could be wrong. It was a small number, right? It's Noah's family, right? Noah's family, and then here, this is the next one. We have 70, right? They're surviving a famine, right? You go on, you fast forward again, and then you get to what? You get to like the kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdoms falling. You have people that are put on exile, and a remnant remains, and a remnant goes back to rebuild the temple. You fast forward again into different areas in time, like let's say the early church, first century church. For 300 years they are heavily persecuted. It's the story of Nero burning Christians on crosses to light the city of Rome. Right? Horrible persecution that went for hundreds of years for the early church. And there's these questions of Christians that were renouncing their faith so that they wouldn't die. But then all of a sudden, 3rd century, Constantine shows up, right? And the emperor of Rome becomes Christian, and all of a sudden, the persecuted religion becomes the state religion. And then all of a sudden you have the remnant few that are like pointing fingers, like, hey, I didn't give in, did you? And they came up with this term called lapsed. People that renounced their faith but came back to the church, and they kind of looked down upon them. Right? So there was these periods of heavy, intense suffering or persecution, whether it was a natural act or whether it was an oppressive agent like the government. Right? I could even look at Korea's history, Japanese occupation. There's a small Christian population, they're being persecuted, And then the Shinto shrine issue comes up, and they say, if you're a good Japanese citizen or whatever, you're going to go to the Shinto shrine. And they're like, this is a religious act. And one by one, every main part of the church started to give in, except for part of the Presbyterian church. Right? This is one of the reasons why the Presbyterian church is so divided, because some of them gave in, some of them didn't. Right? And so again, you have this issue where there is intense persecution going on, and there is a remnant, a small group of people that stands firm through that test. Next slide, please. But what you also see, after that cycle of persecution and difficulty, whatever that remnant is, all of a sudden, they blow up. That 70 that were saved in Egypt, if you actually look at the population as you fast forward to Exodus, right? 400 years later, that 70, I think they say, if you look at the census that's taken in the Old Testament, it numbered up to around 700,000 men. That's not women and children. So most people think if you add that all together, adding women and children to that 70, it's probably closer to 2 million. That's a lot of babies. I don't care about how much, like 400 years is a long time, but that's a lot of babies to go from 70 to 2 million, right? They blew up. You know, you look at the persecution of the first century church, and once it becomes a state religion, all of a sudden Christianity just takes over the entire Roman Empire. Right? Honestly, you even look at Korea, after Japanese occupation ends and the persecution ends, that's really where the church took a huge foothold in Korea. And so why am I sharing about all this? Now this is a little bit of a tangent, but what I really feel God has been speaking to me very recently is I went into this series, this theme that we've been going over for the whole year, because I really thought God was trying to teach us, how do we live in this current age, in this current society? Understanding that this is an age of persecution. This is an age where we are being challenged as believers to really embrace the cost of believing. But I think what he's actually really been trying to tell me is that it's time to preserve the remnant. Now, what do I mean by this? A couple years ago, one of my pastor mentors was coming from the States, and he's from Texas, and he was telling me he's been preaching a lot about the remnant. I'm like, what does that mean? And what he was telling me was that he really felt America was moving in a direction where it's not about reaching the masses anymore, but it's actually more about focusing on the few that will stand. What does that mean? That means that we are moving to an age of heavy persecution, in my personal opinion. You know, some people I know in other churches have been talking a lot about end times. They've been talking a lot about we're moving into the end times. I don't know about that, but I can tell you guys that we are moving into a time where, again, you are going to be challenged to either stand firm in your faith or to kind of compromise. And to kind of just give in a little bit. And to be more, like the main buzzword right now is tolerant. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing right now. But the good news is for those of us that are willing to stand firm in the faith, to cling to God and to say, I will not buckle down. I will not give up what I know as truth. And I will willingly proclaim it to others that ask. The good news is that when you get through that cycle of persecution, there's an explosion, a growth that will go beyond what you ever imagined. 70 to 2 million. Right? And so what I really feel like is happening in our current age is that we are going through this intense persecution where I think it'll really, you're really going to be challenged in terms of what it means to be a Christian. But for us to stand firm in that will lead to a generation of explosive growth. Here in Korea, back in America, like it saddens me to see where the church is going right now, but at the same time, my hope is in where it will go in the future. So the challenge is how do we preserve a remnant? Next slide, please. So we are back in this age of persecution. Next slide, please. And so the question is, are we willing to hold on to him and to not compromise? I don't want to get too much into details, but I think this is really what God has been speaking to me very recently. Especially as we get into, we're going through the book of Revelation in our Bible studies. Daniel itself is very similar to the book of Revelation, very eerily similar. And again, I think God is really speaking to us. I think one of the things in Joseph was, don't forget the generations before you. But the other thing I think he's really trying to speak very clearly to me right now is, persecution is already here. And it's only going to increase. So will we be part of that remnant that doesn't compromise? That's the question. But there's a hope that he will take the remnant and blow it up. So be challenged first by the example of Joseph, the example that he gave of constantly glorifying God in his successes. And I think one of the things that I want to remind us as believers is God wants us to be successful. I think a lot of people think, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to be bad at everything. And like, oh, glory to God. No, God desires us to be successful because in our success, we glorify him. So I challenge you guys in whatever you're doing, whether you're studying, whether you're working, or just within your family life, within all these different relationships that we have, strive for success, but do it in a way that glorifies him. Live a life like Joseph. And as a church and as a community, let's strive to preserve a remnant. Let's strive to live lives that are holy and in many ways are countercultural to the society that we live in right now. Let's take a moment to pray and then we'll go ahead and close. I want us to take a moment to just pray into whatever God is speaking to you, whether it's challenges on this model that Joseph has shown us, or whether it's just understanding the times that we're in. I just want us to take a moment to pray into these things and to ask him to give us wisdom and clarity, and wisdom, again, to know how to press on and how to act in our given circumstances and situations. Let's pray, and then I'll go ahead and close this in a moment. Let's pray. Help us to stand firm, Lord. That we would be your holy people, Lord, and that we would cling to you all the Lord, that you would sustain us, you would give us courage, you would give us strength, you would surround us with brothers and sisters who would continue to carry us along with them, Lord. That we would be a people of God, that in how we live our lives and what we do, we will continue to reveal you. And Father, I pray, Lord, that you would help us to see the reality of the age that we're living in, Lord, that we're living in an age where there is a cost to faith, there is a cost to saying that we are believers, that we follow Jesus Christ. And I pray, Lord, that we will be wise in how we live, that we